Birthdays are supposed to be celebratory, right? Balloons, cake, candles, maybe even a thoughtful gift. That's what I expected when I walked into that dimly lit Italian restaurant with Claire. The place was our favorite, tucked away from the hustle and bustle of the city. We'd been coming here for years. Anniversaries, random date nights, celebrations with friends. But this night wasn't about pasta or Pinot Noir. It was about devastation, served with a side of betrayal. Claire was smiling when I sat down, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. I should have noticed that. I should have noticed the way her hands trembled slightly when she reached for her wine glass. But I didn't. I was too busy thinking about how she had been distant lately, too caught up in wondering if maybe tonight was her way of fixing things. I even imagined there'd be a small box waiting for me. A watch, cufflinks, something thoughtful. Instead, there was a neatly wrapped package in front of me, silver paper shimmering under the soft candlelight. "Open it," she said, her voice calm and steady, as if she hadn't just spent hours preparing a knife for my heart. I peeled the paper back slowly, savoring the moment, unaware of what lay beneath. And then I saw it. Divorce papers. The words stared back at me, bold and unapologetic. My hands froze, unable to fully grasp what I was holding. My 45th birthday gift was a death sentence for my 22-year marriage. "It's time, Jonathan," she said. "I've given you everything. Everything I had to give. But I can't do this anymore." Her tone was calm, almost gentle, but her words hit like a freight train. The world around me faded. The clinking of glasses, the quiet hum of conversation, even the warmth of the candlelight. All I could hear was my own voice in my head screaming, "This can't be happening." "Everything?" I managed, my voice barely above a whisper. "What are you talking about, Claire?" "You know what I mean," she replied, folding her hands neatly on the table like we were discussing the weather. "I've spent years trying to make this work, trying to hold us together, but it's over. We've grown apart. You know that." The way she said it, so matter-of-factly, made me want to laugh, or maybe cry. I wasn't sure which. "Grown apart?" I repeated, louder this time, drawing a few curious glances from nearby diners. "Claire, we've been married for 2 decades. We raised children together. We built a life." She sighed, her eyes darting around the room. "Lower your voice, Jonathan. This isn't the place for a scene." "Oh, but it's the place to hand me divorce papers?" My voice cracked, anger bubbling to the surface. "What the hell, Claire? On my birthday?" She flinched, just barely, but quickly recovered. "I thought it would be symbolic." "Symbolic?" I leaned back in my chair, stunned. "Symbolic of what? How much you hate me?" Her jaw tightened, but she didn't respond. Instead, she reached for her wine glass, taking a long, slow sip. It was the kind of move you make when you've rehearsed every second of a conversation in your head and know exactly how it's going to end. I looked back at the papers in my hands, my eyes scanning the details even though I couldn't focus. Words like fair settlement and amicable separation jumped out at me, and I couldn't help but laugh bitterly. This was Claire's idea of fair? Ambushing me on my birthday with the destruction of everything we'd built together? "You don't think I deserve more than this?" I asked, my voice low but no less angry. "You couldn't even wait until tomorrow?" Her lips pressed into a thin line. "Jonathan, I'm doing this for both of us. We've been pretending for years, and it's exhausting. Don't you feel it too?" What I felt, sitting there in that restaurant surrounded by people oblivious to my world crumbling, was humiliation. Humiliation and rage. I wanted to shout, to demand answers, to make her explain how she could sit there so composed while my heart shattered into a million pieces. But instead, I stayed quiet, because deep down, I knew she was right about one thing. Our marriage hadn't been perfect for a long time. That didn't make this any less cruel. The waiter came by then, hesitating as he asked if we were ready to order. I shook my head, my appetite long gone. Claire waved him away, as calm as ever. "I'm sorry it had to be this way," she said once we were alone again. "I hope we can handle this like adults." "Like adults," I repeated, my voice dripping with sarcasm. "Sure, let's be civil." Because there's nothing more adult than wrapping up divorce papers like a birthday present. For the first time, she looked genuinely hurt, but she didn't apologize. Instead, she said the words that would haunt me long after that night. "You'll see, Jonathan, this is for the best." I pushed my chair back, the screech of wood on tile cutting through the restaurant's murmur. Without another word, I walked out, leaving the papers and my wife on the table. Because at that moment, I knew two things. My marriage was over, and I wasn't going down without a fight. The drive home that night was a blur. I didn't notice the streetlights or the familiar route I'd driven for years. I barely registered the comforting hum of the engine. All I could hear were her words. "I've given you everything. This is for the best." They echoed in my head, twisting into accusations, questions, and anger I didn't know how to direct. How could she say that? How could she act like I meant so little? When I finally pulled into the driveway, our house stood there as it always had, solid and steady. It had been our home for more than 2 decades. We'd painted those walls together, argued about furniture placement, and hosted Christmas dinners here. And now, it was just another battleground. I sat in the car, staring at the porch light glowing in the dark, and felt the weight of it all pressing down on me. Inside, the silence was suffocating. Claire wasn't home yet, and for that, I was grateful. I didn't think I could face her without unraveling. I poured myself a drink, whiskey, neat, and sat in the dim light of the living room, surrounded by memories. Family photos lined the walls, smiling faces frozen in time. I wondered how many of those smiles had been real, how many had been staged for the sake of appearances. Had I been blind? Had I missed the signs? I replayed the last few years in my mind, looking for clues, moments that might explain how we ended up here. There were plenty. The late nights at work, the quiet dinners where conversation felt more like a chore, the way her laughter had become rare and fleeting. I could pinpoint the cracks now, the fractures in our marriage that had grown wider with each passing year. But at the time, I hadn't seen them. Or maybe I had and just didn't want to admit it, because admitting it would have meant facing the truth. We were drifting apart. Still, knowing something isn't the same as accepting it. And I couldn't accept it. Not yet. Not when everything she'd said felt so rehearsed, so calculated. Claire wasn't a cruel person. At least, she hadn't been. So why had she chosen to end things like this? Why now? I thought back to the way she looked at dinner. Calm, collected, almost relieved. She'd made up her mind long before I ever saw those papers. And suddenly, I realized the betrayal didn't just start tonight. It had been happening for months, maybe years, in silence. The nights she stayed late at work. The weekends when she suddenly needed me time. The private phone calls she brushed off as unimportant. I'd let it all slide because I trusted her, because I never imagined she'd betray me. But now, it was all coming into focus. Claire wasn't just ending our marriage. She'd been preparing for it. Every moment of distance, every excuse, every quiet sigh when she thought I wasn't looking, had been part of a larger plan. She'd been untying the knots that bound us together, one thread at a time. I got up and walked to our bedroom, half expecting to find her there. The bed was empty, the covers still neatly made. I noticed her side of the closet. Her clothes were still there, but it felt like she'd already left. Her presence lingered like a ghost, something I couldn't touch or hold on to. The whiskey burned as I took another sip, standing in the doorway of a life I no longer recognized. Claire had been so careful, so deliberate in her actions. And I had been so trusting, so oblivious. My thoughts turned to her words. "I've given you everything." What did she mean by that? The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. She'd made herself the martyr, painting me as the ungrateful husband who took and took until she had nothing left. But that wasn't fair. I'd provided for her, worked hard to build a life for us, given her everything she'd ever wanted, or so I thought. But maybe that was the problem. Maybe I'd been so focused on giving her things. Security, stability, comfort, that I hadn't noticed what she actually needed. And now it was too late. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the photo on the nightstand. It was from our anniversary trip to Paris, years ago. We looked so happy, so in love. But looking at it now, I couldn't help but wonder, was it real? Or had we just been playing our roles, smiling for the camera because that's what couples do? The silence in the house grew heavier, pressing against my chest until I couldn't breathe. I got up and grabbed my phone, dialing a number before I could talk myself out of it. Dad? Megan's voice was groggy, like I'd woken her up. Hey, sweetheart, I said, trying to sound normal. Sorry to call so late. It's fine. Is everything okay? The concern in her voice nearly broke me. Megan didn't know yet. I didn't know how to tell her that the foundation of her family was crumbling. I just wanted to hear your voice, I said, feeling foolish. Are you sure you're okay? She asked again. No, I wasn't. But I couldn't tell her that. Yeah, I'm fine. Go back to sleep. I'll talk to you tomorrow. After I hung up, the silence returned, louder than before. I sat in the living room again, staring at the divorce papers Claire had left on the kitchen counter. She'd betrayed me in silence, unraveling our life together thread by thread. And now, she expected me to just accept it. But as I stared at those papers, one thing became clear. I wouldn't. I woke up the next morning to a house that felt colder than ever. The divorce papers were still on the kitchen counter where I'd left them, staring at me like a bad decision I'd made and couldn't take back. I poured a cup of coffee and sat down at the table, staring at them again. Claire was nowhere to be seen, probably at work or anywhere that wasn't here. That had been her pattern lately, leaving early, coming back late, and avoiding conversations that mattered. The silence gnawed at me as I sipped my coffee, the bitterness of it matching the weight in my chest. How had we gotten here? I knew our marriage hadn't been perfect, but divorce? That felt like a foreign concept, something other people dealt with, not us, not me. I picked up the papers and started flipping through them, not really reading, just scanning. Words like equitable distribution and no contest stood out, but they felt empty, lifeless. I didn't even know where to begin. What I did know was that this wasn't just about growing apart. No one wraps divorce papers like a birthday present unless they've planned it meticulously. Claire had been planning this for months, maybe even years. That much was obvious. But why? And why now? I didn't know how to answer those questions, so I decided to start with someone who might. I grabbed my phone and dialed her. It rang 3 times before going to voicemail. Typical. I left a message, trying to keep my voice even. Claire, we need to talk. Call me when you have a moment. Hanging up felt like admitting defeat, but I wasn't done. Not by a long shot. I spent the rest of the morning pacing the house, trying to piece together the puzzle. There had to be something I'd missed, some clue hidden in the past few months. The late nights. The constant work emergencies. The sudden need for space. All of it painted a picture, one I didn't want to see. I opened my laptop and started searching through our shared bank accounts. If Claire was planning this divorce, she'd need money to back it up. Sure enough, there were irregularities. Transfers to accounts I didn't recognize, withdrawals I hadn't authorized. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough to make me pause. I scrolled further, checking dates and amounts, and my stomach twisted when I saw the pattern. The transaction started about 6 months ago. Right around the time Claire started acting distant. She wasn't just planning a divorce. She was planning her escape. I leaned back in my chair, the realization hitting me like a punch to the gut. Claire had been building her exit strategy while I was busy keeping our lives running. While I was working late to make sure we could retire comfortably, she was siphoning money into accounts I didn't even know existed. My phone buzzed, pulling me out of my thoughts. It was Megan. Hey, Dad, she said when I answered. You okay? You sounded weird last night. I hesitated, not wanting to burden her with this. Megan was busy with her own life, her job, her boyfriend, her future. She didn't need to worry about her parents falling apart. But then I thought about Claire, about the way she blindsided me. Someone needed to know. Megan, I said, my voice heavy. Your mom gave me divorce papers last night. There was a long silence on the other end. What? Are you serious? As serious as it gets, I replied. She's been planning this for months, maybe longer. Have you talked to her? She asked, her voice sharp with anger. She's not answering my calls, I said. And honestly, I'm not sure I'd know what to say if she did. Megan sighed. Do you want me to talk to her? Maybe she'll listen to me. No, I said quickly. This is between your mother and me. I don't understand why she'd do this. Why now? I don't either, Megan admitted. But if she's been planning this, maybe there's more to it than just the two of you growing apart. Her words hung in the air long after we ended the call. More to it. I couldn't shake the feeling that she was right. Claire wasn't the impulsive type. She didn't make decisions without a reason. If she'd been planning this, she had a reason, and I needed to find out what it was. I spent the rest of the day digging through old emails, financial records, anything I could think of that might give me a clue. That's when I stumbled across something odd. A series of calendar entries labeled Meet Our. They were scattered over the past few months, always during lunch hours or after work. Who was R? I didn't have an answer, but I had a feeling it wasn't just a friend or coworker. Not when it lined up so perfectly with everything else. The distance, the money, the papers. I stared at the calendar entries until my vision blurred, my mind racing with possibilities. An affair? Maybe. But this felt bigger than that. This felt calculated. I closed the laptop and leaned back in my chair, exhaustion settling over me. I didn't have all the answers yet, but I was starting to put the pieces together. Claire wanted out, and she'd been planning her exit for a long time. But if she thought I'd just roll over and let it happen, she didn't know me as well as she thought she did. The next morning, I woke up with one clear goal. I needed professional help. I wasn't going to stumble my way through this. Claire had clearly been preparing for months, maybe years, and if I didn't get ahead of this, she'd bulldoze me in the process. That's how I ended up in Sandra Hayes' office, sitting across from her at a large mahogany desk that screamed competence and confidence. Sandra was a divorce lawyer with a reputation for being tough as nails, and that's exactly what I needed. So, she said, folding her hands neatly on the desk, tell me everything. And I did. From the birthday dinner ambush to the mysterious bank account transactions, I laid it all out. Her expression remained neutral, though her pen moved quickly across the notepad in front of her. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and let out a long breath. Well, Jonathan, it sounds like your wife has been very thorough in her planning. Tell me something I don't know, I muttered, running a hand through my hair. Sandra ignored my frustration and pulled a folder from her desk. Let's start with the divorce papers she gave you. Do you have them with you? I slid the neatly wrapped bundle across the desk, the ridiculous silver bow still attached. Sandra smirked at it before opening the folder and scanning the contents. It's a standard no-fault divorce filing, she said. She's requesting an equitable distribution of assets and waiving spousal support. At first glance, it seems reasonable. Reasonable? I said, my voice rising. She's been draining our accounts and setting herself up for months. Sandra raised a hand to calm me. I said it seems reasonable, but looks can be deceiving. She flipped through the pages again, her sharp eyes narrowing. What's interesting is that she's requesting sole ownership of your primary residence, despite it being jointly owned. That's not standard unless one party plans to stay in the house. She's asking for the house? I repeated, feeling the anger bubbling up again. She didn't mention that. Of course not, Sandra said. It's easier to slip details past you when you're blindsided. But here's the thing. If she's requesting the house, she's likely counting on you agreeing to it in exchange for other assets. That's where we need to be careful. I leaned forward. What do you mean? Sandra tapped the papers with her pen. She's trying to control the narrative, Jonathan. By giving you these papers in such a public, dramatic way, she's hoping you'll feel guilty or pressured into accepting her terms without fully understanding the implications. Well, that's not happening, I said firmly. Good, Sandra replied, because there's something else that doesn't sit right with me. You mentioned those bank transactions, the ones going into accounts you don't recognize. I want to take a closer look at those. I nodded, grateful that someone was finally taking this seriously. What do you think she's doing with the money? It could be anything, Sandra said. She might be hiding assets, preparing for a new investment, or even funding a separate life you don't know about. But until we have concrete proof, it's just speculation. That's where a forensic accountant comes in. Forensic accountant? Sandra smiled faintly. They're like detectives, but for money. They'll trace every dollar that's left your shared accounts and figure out where it went. If Claire has been hiding something, they'll find it. I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. And if they do find something? Then we use it, Sandra said bluntly. If she's been hiding assets or mismanaging joint funds, that's grounds to challenge the settlement. It also paints her in a very unfavorable light, which could work in your favor if this goes to court. The word court sent a chill down my spine. I hadn't even thought about that possibility yet. Do you think it'll come to that? I asked. It depends on Claire, Sandra said. If she's as calculated as you say, she'll try to avoid court. It's messy, expensive, and exposes both parties to scrutiny. But we need to be prepared for anything. I nodded slowly, the weight of the situation settling over me like a heavy blanket. So, what's our next step? Sandra closed the folder and looked me square in the eye. First, we hire a forensic accountant to look into those transactions. Second, we file an official response to the divorce petition, outlining our concerns about the financial discrepancies. And third, we start building a case that shows Claire isn't as fair and honest as she wants you to believe. Her confidence was reassuring, but I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that Claire still had the upper hand. She'd had months to plan this, and I was just starting to catch up. Jonathan, Sandra said, breaking into my thoughts, I know this feels overwhelming, but trust me. You're not the first person to be blindsided by a divorce, and you won't be the last. The important thing is that you're taking action. That's more than a lot of people do. I nodded, though the knot in my stomach remained. Thank you, I said. She smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. Don't thank me yet. We've got a long road ahead. As I left her office, I felt a mix of emotions. Anger, fear, determination, and something else I couldn't quite place. Claire thought she'd outmaneuvered me, but she'd underestimated one thing. I wasn't going to sit back and let her take everything. Not without a fight. I thought I'd feel better after meeting with Sandra, but instead, I felt heavier, like I'd opened a door to a storm I wasn't prepared for. The forensic accountant she recommended, Thomas Grant, reached out later that evening. His voice was calm and measured, the kind of tone that said he'd seen this kind of thing more times than he could count. Mr. Jacobs, he began, I'll need access to all your joint accounts, credit card statements, and any records of significant purchases or transfers over the last 5 years. 5 years? I repeated, taken aback. Isn't that overkill? Not if your wife has been planning this for a long time, Thomas replied matter-of-factly. These things don't happen overnight. If she's been hiding money or making unusual transactions, there'll be a pattern. A pattern. That word stuck with me as I dug through files and spreadsheets later that night, trying to make sense of it all. I thought about Claire's lunches with R, the accounts I didn't recognize, and the faint, almost imperceptible distance that had crept into our lives over the years. It was all a blur of disconnected dots, and I couldn't see the bigger picture. By the time I emailed everything to Thomas, it was well past midnight. I sat there in the dim glow of my laptop, staring at the files I'd sent, and realized something. I didn't really know Claire anymore. Not the Claire who wrapped divorce papers in silver paper, and not the Claire who quietly siphoned money from our accounts. The next morning, Thomas called. Mr. Jacobs, I've had a chance to review some of the preliminary records you sent. And? I asked, gripping my coffee mug tighter than necessary. There's definitely something unusual, he said. It looks like your wife has been transferring small amounts, $1,000 here, $2,500 there, into a private account every few weeks for about 7 months. 7 months, I repeated. That lined up with the strange shifts in her behavior. The late nights, the distant looks, the perfectly timed arguments that seemed to end with her retreating to another room. Thomas continued, what's interesting is that the account she's transferring to isn't entirely in her name. It's a joint account with someone named Ryan Carter. Do you recognize the name? The name hit me like a sucker punch. R, I muttered. The mysterious initial in her calendar entries. No, I don't recognize him. Who is he? Based on the limited information I have, it seems he's a financial advisor, Thomas said. He's also listed as the co-owner of a shell company tied to one of the transfers. I sank into my chair, the pieces starting to come together in my mind. So, she's not just hiding money. She's working with someone to, what? Funnel it into a business? It's possible, Thomas said. I'll need more time to dig into it, but this is already enough to raise red flags. I thanked him and hung up, the knot in my stomach growing tighter. Claire wasn't just planning to leave me. She was building a future without me, and she'd roped someone else into her plans. Ryan Carter wasn't just a name on a spreadsheet. He was part of something bigger, something Claire clearly didn't want me to know about. That evening, I sat down with Megan and Lucas, my daughter and her fiancé, to tell them what I'd learned. Megan's reaction was immediate and explosive. She's been hiding money with some random guy? Megan shouted, pacing the room. That's not just sneaky, that's disgusting. Lucas, ever the calm one, placed a hand on her shoulder. Let's not jump to conclusions. Jump to conclusions? Megan snapped. Dad's been blindsided, and now we find out she's been funneling money to someone named Ryan Carter? What part of this doesn't scream betrayal? She wasn't wrong. The betrayal wasn't just emotional anymore. It was strategic, calculated. Every dollar Claire had moved, every meeting she'd scheduled, was another thread in a web I hadn't even known existed. Do you think she's having an affair? Megan asked, her voice softer now. I hesitated. The thought had crossed my mind more times than I cared to admit, but I couldn't bring myself to say it out loud. I don't know, I admitted. And honestly, I'm not sure what's worse, the possibility of an affair or the fact that she's been building a life behind my back. Megan's face softened, and she sat beside me, placing a hand on mine. We'll figure this out, Dad. You're not alone in this. Lucas nodded. If you want, I can look into this Ryan Carter guy. See if there's more to him than just the financial advisor angle. I nodded, grateful for their support, but still feeling the weight of it all pressing down on me. Thanks, I said. I need to know the truth. Later that night, when the house was quiet and everyone else had gone to bed, I sat in my office staring at an old photo of Claire and me. It was from our first year of marriage, taken at a park during a picnic. We were both laughing, carefree, and full of hope for the future. Now, I didn't even recognize her. Who was Ryan Carter? What kind of future had she been building behind my back? And how long had she been planning this? One thing was certain. I wasn't going to let her keep me in the dark any longer. Claire had her secrets, but I was determined to uncover every single one of them. By the time I finally heard the garage door creak open later that week, signaling Claire's return home, I was ready. Or at least I thought I was. I'd rehearsed the confrontation in my head 100 times. Every question, every retort, every demand for answers. But when the moment arrived, when she walked through the door with that same calm, detached expression she'd worn at the restaurant, my throat tightened. Jonathan, she said, setting her purse down on the kitchen counter as though nothing was amiss. You're still awake? I didn't respond immediately. I sat at the dining table, the papers she'd left me spread out in front of me, alongside a copy of the transactions Thomas had uncovered. We need to talk, I said, my voice steady but strained. She paused, her hand still on her purse strap. It's late. Can it wait until morning? No, Claire, it can't. The weight of my tone must have struck her because she sighed and sat across from me, her movements deliberate. All right, Jonathan, what's on your mind? I slid the bank statements across the table, watching her face closely as she glanced at them. For a moment, just a flicker, I thought I saw surprise. But she masked it quickly, setting the papers down with an air of indifference. What is this supposed to be? She asked, her tone neutral. Don't do that, I said, my voice rising slightly. Don't pretend you don't know. These are the transfers you've been making for the last 7 months. Thousands of dollars going into a private account, one that's not even fully in your name. She didn't flinch, but I could see her jaw tighten. I don't know what you're accusing me of, Jonathan, but I'm not going to sit here and… Ryan Carter, I interrupted. The name landed between us like a hammer. Who is he, Claire? Her eyes narrowed, her composure cracking just slightly. How do you know that name? I've been doing my homework, I said, leaning forward. You know, catching up on all the things you've been hiding from me. So, I'll ask again. Who is Ryan Carter? For a long moment, she didn't answer. She just stared at me, her lips pressed into a thin line. Finally, she said, "He's a financial advisor. Someone I hired to help me plan for the future." Plan for the future? I repeated, incredulous. You mean plan for a future without me? She looked away, and that was all the confirmation I needed. My heart was pounding now, anger surging through me like a tidal wave. "Do you have any idea how humiliating this is?" I demanded. "You've been planning this for months, maybe longer, and you didn't have the decency to tell me? Instead, you sneak around, draining our accounts, meeting with some stranger, and then blindsiding me with divorce papers? On my birthday, no less." Her gaze snapped back to me, and for the first time, I saw a spark of anger in her eyes. "Don't you dare act like this is all on me, Jonathan. You think I wanted this? You think I woke up one day and decided to tear our life apart? Didn't you?" I shot back. "No," she yelled, slamming her hand on the table. "But what choice did I have? You've been checked out of this marriage for years, Jonathan. Years. I gave everything to this family, to you, and you barely noticed. While you were off working late and building your career, I was the one holding everything together. I was the one who sacrificed. And what did I get in return? Nothing." Her words hit like a slap, each one cutting deeper than the last. But I wasn't ready to back down. "So what? This is payback? You decided to empty our accounts and run off with some financial advisor because you felt unappreciated?" Her laugh was cold and bitter. "Ryan isn't some affair, Jonathan. He's helping me make sure I don't walk away from this with nothing. Because let's face it, you would have left me with scraps if I didn't protect myself." I stared at her, stunned. "You really think that little of me?" "I think I know you," she said quietly, "and I know how men like you operate. You'll fight for every penny because you see it as your right. But this time, I'm fighting back." For a moment, we just sat there, the tension between us so thick it was suffocating. I didn't know whether to be furious or heartbroken. "You say I didn't notice you," I said finally, my voice soft. "But did you ever stop to think about why? Did you ever stop to ask yourself if I was working so hard because I thought that's what you wanted? I gave you everything I thought I was supposed to: security, comfort, stability. I didn't realize you wanted something else because you never told me." She shook her head, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I shouldn't have had to tell you, Jonathan. You should have known." We sat in silence after that, both of us too drained to argue anymore. Eventually, she stood up, her movements slow and deliberate. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But this is the only way I know how to move forward." And with that, she walked upstairs, leaving me alone with the shattered pieces of our life. I stared at the empty space where she'd been sitting, her words echoing in my mind. This is the only way I know how to move forward. But as I sat there, anger began to rise again, stronger than before. Claire might have been planning her future for months, but now it was time for me to plan mine. And I wasn't going to let her walk away unscathed. The next day, I woke up with a renewed sense of purpose. I wasn't going to let Claire control the narrative of our divorce. If she had secrets, I was determined to uncover every single one of them. The thought of her planning this betrayal with such precision burned in my chest. I needed answers, and I needed them now. By mid-morning, Thomas Grant, the forensic accountant, called with updates. His voice carried the same calm professionalism, but I could sense there was something significant in his findings. "Mr. Jacobs," he began, "I've traced additional transactions that confirm some of our suspicions. It's not just the joint account with Ryan Carter. It's deeper than that." "Deeper how?" I asked, gripping the phone tightly. "There's a shell company in Claire's name," Thomas said, "but Ryan Carter is also listed as a co-owner. The company is tied to multiple transfers from your joint account, as well as funds redirected from one of your retirement accounts." My stomach dropped. "She's pulling money from my retirement?" "Yes," he confirmed. "The withdrawal started 6 months ago, right around the time she began meeting with Carter regularly. It looks like the funds were funneled into the shell company and then used to purchase shares in several tech startups." I leaned back in my chair, my mind racing. Claire had always been cautious with money, never want to take risks. But now, She was gambling our future on tech startups? And with someone I didn't even know? Is it legal? I asked. Technically, yes, Thomas replied. But it's unethical, given that she's using joint marital assets without your knowledge or consent. That's leverage you can use in negotiations, or court, if it comes to that. Leverage. The word felt hollow. I didn't just want leverage, I wanted the truth. Anything else? I asked, bracing myself. There's one more thing, Thomas said, his tone heavier now. I found evidence of a property purchase. A penthouse in the city. It was bought 3 months ago through the shell company. Both Claire and Ryan Carter are listed as co-owners. I felt the air leave my lungs. A penthouse? Yes, he said. The move-in date is set for next week. For a moment, I couldn't speak. The betrayal I thought I'd already felt now had a physical address. While I was sitting in the house we'd built together, drowning in the memories of our life, Claire had been setting up a new home, a new life, with another man. Thank you, Thomas. I managed, my voice strained. Keep digging. I need everything. After hanging up, I sat in silence, staring out the window. The penthouse, the shell company, the startup investments. It all pointed to one thing. Claire wasn't just leaving me, she was replacing me. That evening, I waited for her to come home, the anger bubbling just below the surface. When she walked through the door, carrying her usual air of detachment, I was ready. We need to talk, I said, my voice sharp enough to stop her in her tracks. Jonathan, she sighed, setting down her bag. We've already talked. I don't see what more there is to say. Oh, there's plenty, I said, standing and walking toward her. Like the shell company you and Ryan Carter set up, or the penthouse you two bought. Care to explain? Her eyes widened, the first crack in her carefully constructed mask. I don't know what you're talking about. Don't lie to me, Claire, I snapped. I have the proof. Every transaction, every property deed, every last dollar you stole from our accounts. Did you think I wouldn't find out? Did you think I'd just roll over and let you walk away with everything? She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. For the first time, she looked genuinely cornered. This wasn't just about a divorce, was it? I pressed, my voice growing louder. This was about building a whole new life without me. A life you've been planning for months, maybe years, while I sat here like an idiot, trusting you. Her expression shifted then. Guilt, anger, and something else I couldn't quite place. You don't understand, she said quietly. Then explain it to me, I demanded. She took a deep breath, her hands shaking slightly as she folded her arms across her chest. Ryan isn't what you think. He's a business partner. That's it. The investments, the penthouse, everything. It's about securing my future. I couldn't rely on you anymore, Jonathan. I had to take control. Take control? I repeated, incredulous. By stealing from me? By lying to me? You didn't just blindside me with divorce papers. You've been dismantling our life piece by piece behind my back. She looked away, unable to meet my eyes. I did what I had to do. No, Claire, I said, my voice cold. You did what you wanted to do. You planned this. You lied. And now you're standing here trying to justify it as if that makes it okay. She didn't respond, and the silence that followed was deafening. For the first time, I saw her not as my wife but as a stranger. Someone who had calculated every move, every lie, to get what she wanted. I hope it was worth it, I said finally, turning away, because you're going to find out just how far I'm willing to go to fight back. As I walked upstairs, I felt the weight of everything pressing down on me. The betrayal, the lies, the years I'd spent trusting someone who had been plotting against me. But beneath it all, there was something else. Determination. Claire thought she could outsmart me, that I'd crumble under the weight of her betrayal. But she'd underestimated me, and she was about to find out just how wrong she was. The tension was a living thing between us after that confrontation. Claire had barely spoken a word to me since the night I called her out about the penthouse and the shell company. She left early in the mornings, returned late, and avoided me entirely when she was home. Part of me wanted to push for answers, to force her to confront the damage she'd done, but the other part of me, the part that was still raw and hurt, knew I wasn't ready to face her again. The opportunity came a week later at a charity gala we'd both been invited to attend. It was one of those events where you're supposed to smile for photos, network with influential people, and pretend everything in your life is picture perfect. Claire had RSVP'd long before the divorce papers, and when I saw her name on the guest list, I decided to go. Not because I wanted to, but because I needed to. I needed people to see me, the other half of our crumbling marriage, standing tall. And, truthfully, I needed Claire to see that I wasn't going to disappear quietly into the shadows. The gala was held in a sprawling ballroom, with chandeliers glittering overhead and a live band playing softly in the background. I arrived early, blending into the crowd as best I could. Claire, of course, arrived late, making her entrance like she always did, with calculated grace. She was dressed in a sleek black gown, her hair swept up elegantly. For a moment, I felt the old pang of admiration, but it was quickly overshadowed by anger. She spotted me almost immediately, her expression neutral as she made her way across the room. She wasn't alone, though. Ryan Carter was with her. It was one thing to know his name, to see his signature on documents and his name tied to transactions. But it was another thing entirely to see him in person. He was younger than I'd expected, polished in that smug, self-assured way that screamed opportunist. "Jonathan," Claire greeted me, her voice calm and composed. "I wasn't expecting you tonight." I took a sip of my drink, masking the storm brewing inside me. "I figured I'd stop by. It's for a good cause, right?" Her eyes flickered briefly to Ryan before returning to me. "This is Ryan Carter," she said, introducing him like I hadn't already spent hours uncovering everything about him. He extended a hand, his smile practiced and insincere. "Jonathan, I've heard a lot about you." I didn't take his hand. "I'll bet you have." Ryan hesitated, but Claire quickly stepped in. "Jonathan, this isn't the time or place for." "For what?" I interrupted, my voice low but steady. "For honesty? Because I think it's exactly the time for that." A few heads turned our way, the nearby hum of conversation faltering. Claire's composure wavered just slightly, her lips tightening. "Jonathan," she said quietly, "can we not do this here?" "Why not?" I countered, my voice growing louder. "You didn't seem to mind publicly humiliating me with divorce papers on my birthday. Why should this be any different?" Ryan shifted uncomfortably, clearly unprepared for the scene unfolding. Claire glanced around, likely calculating the damage to her image. "Jonathan," she hissed, her tone sharper now. "Stop." But I didn't. I couldn't. Months of betrayal, lies, and manipulation came bubbling to the surface, and I let it out. "You want to explain to everyone here why you've been funneling money into a shell company with him?" I gestured at Ryan, whose face had gone pale. "Or maybe you'd like to talk about the penthouse you two co-own. You know, the one you bought with our money?" The room went silent. Every pair of eyes was on us now, and Claire's carefully curated image was crumbling under the weight of my words. "That's enough," she said through gritted teeth, her calm facade completely gone. "No, it's not enough," I shot back. "Because while you've been playing the victim, claiming you've given me everything, you've been stealing from me. From us. So go ahead, Claire. Justify it. Tell everyone here why you thought you could get away with it." Ryan took a step forward, his voice low and measured. "Jonathan, maybe we should—" "You don't get to speak," I snapped, cutting him off. "You don't get to stand here and pretend like you're some innocent bystander when you've been helping her dismantle my life." The crowd began murmuring, whispers spreading like wildfire. Claire looked around, panic flickering in her eyes. For the first time, I saw her vulnerability. She wasn't the composed, calculating woman who had handed me divorce papers with a smile. She was exposed, her lies laid bare for everyone to see. "Jonathan," she said, her voice barely above a whisper now. "Please." But it was too late for please. Too late for apologies or damage control. I set my glass down on the nearest table and straightened my jacket. "I think we're done here," I said, my voice calm once again. "Enjoy the rest of your evening." As I walked out of the ballroom, I could feel the weight of dozens of stares following me. I didn't care. For the first time in months, I felt like I had taken control of the narrative. Claire had spent months planning her exit, building a new life behind my back. But now, she couldn't hide. Let her deal with the fallout. Let Ryan deal with the whispers and the judgment. I was done being the victim in her carefully crafted story, and as I stepped into the cool night air, I realized something. This wasn't just about exposing Claire. It was about reclaiming myself. For the first time, I felt like I was no longer standing in her shadow. The fallout from the gala spread faster than I expected. By the next morning, the whispers had turned into full-blown rumors, and Claire's carefully constructed image was cracking under the weight of scrutiny. I'd spent months feeling blindsided, betrayed, and helpless, but now the tide had turned. Back at Sandra's office, I laid out the events of the previous night. She listened intently, her sharp eyes narrowing as I recounted the public confrontation and the revelations about the shell company, the penthouse, and Ryan Carter's involvement. "You've done well," she said, her voice tinged with approval. "But now it's time to press the advantage." "What's next?" I asked, my resolve firm. She slid a stack of papers across the desk. "First, we're filing injunctions on the shell company and the penthouse. We're freezing any accounts tied to marital assets until the court can review them. Next, we subpoena Ryan Carter. If he's been involved in financial misdeeds, he'll either crack under pressure or incriminate himself trying to defend Claire." I nodded, the weight of her words settling in. "And what about the divorce settlement?" Sandra's smile was predatory. "We challenge it. Every part of it. Claire's actions prove bad faith. The court will see that she's been siphoning funds and making unauthorized decisions. We'll leverage her deceit to secure a fairer settlement, or, if we're lucky, more than fair." For the first time since Claire handed me those divorce papers, I felt like I had a plan. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about justice, about showing Claire that she couldn't dismantle our life without consequences. The next few weeks were a blur of legal maneuvers and mounting tension. Thomas, the forensic accountant, uncovered more damning evidence. Offshore accounts tied to Claire's name, fraudulent signatures on investment documents, and backdated transactions that painted a clear picture of her deception. Ryan Carter, under subpoena, was a different story. He showed up to Sandra's office looking rattled, his usual smug demeanor replaced by nervous energy. When Sandra began questioning him about the shell company, he crumbled faster than I expected. "It wasn't my idea," he stammered, sweat beading on his forehead. "Claire, she told me it was just a way to manage investments. I didn't know she was using joint assets." Sandra didn't buy his act entirely, but his testimony was enough to bolster our case. With every new piece of evidence, Claire's web of lies unraveled further. The court date came quickly, and Claire's demeanor in the courtroom was a stark contrast to her confidence at the gala. She sat rigid, her lawyer whispering frantically in her ear as Sandra laid out the case against her. "Your Honor," Sandra said, her voice steady and commanding, "this is not just a case of a marriage dissolving. It's a case of deceit, manipulation, and financial misconduct. Mrs. Jacobs has not only breached the trust of her husband, but also acted in bad faith by diverting marital assets for personal gain." Claire's lawyer tried to argue that the transfers and purchases were legitimate, but the evidence was overwhelming. The shell company, the offshore accounts, the penthouse, all of it painted a damning picture. When the judge finally ruled in our favor, awarding me a fair share of the marital assets and freezing Claire's illicit accounts, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. It wasn't just about the money. It was about standing up for myself, about reclaiming the narrative Claire had tried to control. After the court proceedings, I started the slow process of rebuilding my life. Megan and Lucas were a constant source of support, their encouragement helping me find strength I didn't know I had. One evening, Megan sat with me in the kitchen, her hand resting on mine. "You know, Dad," she said softly, "I'm proud of you. You didn't let her walk all over you. You fought back." I nodded, a faint smile tugging at my lips. "It wasn't easy," I admitted, "but I wasn't going to let her win." Megan squeezed my hand. "And you didn't. Now it's time to focus on what's next." She was right. For months, my life had revolved around the betrayal and the legal battle. But now, with the weight of the divorce behind me, the future felt wide open. I started taking steps to rediscover myself. I went back to hobbies I'd abandoned years ago. Woodworking, hiking, even a photography class I'd always been curious about. For the first time in years, I wasn't living for someone else. Claire, meanwhile, faded into the background. The penthouse, the shell company, and her professional reputation all suffered under the scrutiny of the court proceedings. I heard through mutual acquaintances that Ryan Carter had distanced himself from her, the weight of the legal fallout too much for him to bear. I didn't take pleasure in her downfall, but I didn't feel sorry for her either. She'd made her choices, and she was living with the consequences. One evening, as I sat on the back porch of the house I'd fought to keep, the sun setting in hues of gold and crimson, I felt something I hadn't in a long time: peace. The battle was over. The scars were still there, but they were a reminder of what I'd endured and overcome. Claire had once told me she'd given me everything. But now, as I looked out at the horizon, I realized something she never understood. The most valuable thing I'd ever had was the strength to rebuild myself. And that, I'd given to myself.